Katerina Yaka watched the German soldiers flee. Streaming from the east, that's what she was seeing. Allied bombers flew above them. She thought they all might die, and then soon there was the silence of all the SS men. When the sun rose the next morning, it was the 1st of May, and they all sang the Internationale. They all sang the Internationale. Katerina Yaka saw red flags flapping in the breeze above the Russian tanks, and she fell upon her knees. And so many different voices in so many different tongues sang the most beautiful song that could ever have been sung. In German, Lithuanian, in Polish and in Dutch, a myriad of melodies has never had been such. In Russian and in Yiddish, Italian and French, emerging from the forests beneath the trench. When the sun rose the next morning, it was the 1st of May, and they all sang the Internationale. When the sun rose the next morning, it was the 1st of May, and they all sang the Internationale. They all sang the Internationale. Völker hört die Signale auf zum letzten Gefecht. Die Internationale erkämpft das Menschenrecht. Völker hört die Signale auf zum letzten Gefecht. Die Internationale erkämpft das Menschenrecht.
Hello and welcome to Revolutionary Socialist Review with Chris Driscoll and Rainer Shea. I'm Chris, and Rainer's here with me. We'll be bringing him on just about immediately. So first off, Rainer, how are you doing?
Hello. In this last week, I've been writing a ton, like every day. In the last couple of days, I've been putting out articles, and I'm eager to discuss, especially the last one that you've picked out, about how climate change will weaken the U.S. military.
Oh, yeah, that looks very interesting. I look forward to that too. I am also eager. So let's see here. To start off with, first of all, I should say the theme of our show on this episode of RSR is U.S. has lost all political influence on Chinese society and on the Chinese people as well. And I've got a little video I want to show from a show. A video from a guy who does a show in China on these kinds of issues. So without really taking up much more time, I'm just going to share that with everybody. Just give me a second here to bring it up.
Joe Biden's first 100 days in office have only further consolidated the Chinese public's disappointment in the US. While Trump pursued a crazy China policy, Biden has continued taking Trump's stance, which confirmed the speculation among many Chinese people that the US detests China's rise. The only goal of the US is to bring down China and make it less competitive rather than promote its progress. This conclusion has never been more certain. What's more, the Biden administration has used Xinjiang issue as the focus of a joint attack on China by the Western world. This has caused particularly negative feelings in China, because the Chinese are well aware of what's behind the past turbulent situation in Xinjiang. They completely reject this labeling of genocide and know that the idea of forced labor is nonsense. The Western unity that the US has brought about through the Xinjiang issue is far less than the unity it has created within China. The Chinese no longer have the illusion of seeing substantial improvements in China-US relations, but they are calm and aware of how important it is for China to tend to its own affairs. US's political influence on Chinese society has almost been completely lost.
There you have it. And I think that the message there is that it is the Obama, Trump, Biden anti-China policy that has caused this rupture, because up until 2011, when Obama started his pivot to Asia, so-called, which is really his pivot to hybrid warfare on the Chinese people. Up until then, the Chinese people had a pretty good positive feeling about the United States of America and about Americans. But that's all been lost. That is political capital that these three idiots who've run our country into the ground, Obama, Trump, and Biden, are the cause of, really. So we can lay all the blame on them. And I thought I'd start off with this because several of our topics tonight really are excuse me, really are having to do in one way or another with China and with the American governments and the American state, the American empire's attitude towards China, hostile, provocative attitude. So I thought we'd start off with this. Rainer, what are your thoughts after seeing this video? Sorry for the slight delays for buffering in it. That was kind of kind of annoying, but otherwise, hopefully you got the message that Mr. Hu was putting out there.
When he said the turbulent past within Xinjiang, he was talking about people getting slaughtered, about random Chinese people getting killed by terrorist attacks that were imported into that part of China by US destabilization operations. The US has a Syria to Xinjiang pipeline of radical religious terror, and they've continuously been trying to use this to foment terrorist attacks within that part of China, with the goal of creating a breakaway state, which they plan to label as East Turkestan, and they plan to create this fascistic religious jihadist state. Basically, if ISIS were in control of a government, of an entire government so that they could hypothetically wage proxy warfare against the rest of China and balkanize China in that sense. And hearing this about how ticked off Chinese people apparently generally are at the labelings of the Xinjiang situation as a genocide, I can definitely understand that, because what's really happened there is the Uyghurs, like all the other ethnic groups within China, have materially benefited from socialism with Chinese characteristics and the great economic expansions that it's provided the population. And to characterize this as a horrible persecution against the Uyghurs is clearly so insulting towards these people who've put so much work into building a workers' democracy that's carrying out these benefits. And it's for this reason of increasing living standards within Xinjiang and elsewhere that U.S. political influence within China has waned so much, because the contradictions within Chinese society are going away as poverty disappears within China. Just last year, extreme poverty completely disappeared within China. And it's for this reason that it's becoming ever harder for the West to foment further terrorist attacks within China, since these Uyghurs have less incentive to become swayed by the extremist propaganda that the West is trying to sneak into China's borders past the Great Firewall. And it seems like at this point, the greatest extent to which Washington can influence events within China is economically. Like apparently the West has been sanctioning Xinjiang, like banning the sale of items manufactured within Xinjiang because they're supposedly created through slave labor, which is total nonsense. And from what I've been hearing, this has actually been driving down the living standards of the people within Xinjiang. Ironically, the very same Uyghurs who the West claims to want to help. Is it true that the West has been able to sabotage socialism with Chinese characteristics, economic gains in this way?
Well, I think they've had an effect. At least that boycott is obviously having an effect, because there have been huge demonstrations throughout China, and especially in Xinjiang, about that the American boycott of Xinjiang cotton, basically. And as a retaliation, Chinese people are boycotting all of those American-owned manufacturers of clothing that then re-import that cotton as finished goods, as clothing, back into China. So I think the Americans, once again, are shooting themselves in the foot. The American state, the American empire, the American imperialists who have stolen our country are shooting themselves in the foot. The Biden gang and so forth, the people on Wall Street, they're shooting themselves in the foot. So, yeah, this is a real tit for tat thing. It's going on many different levels. Economics is one, and Rainer, after you do the next point on NATO's anti-Chinese lies, the following point will deal with a piece of legislation, a $112 billion piece of legislation in the U.S. Congress right now, having to do with countering Chinese tech by setting up, basically it's a response, because China has over the last several years, set up a number of tech hubs to emphasize building up their semiconductor industry, building up their different various electronics and software industries. And this is a U.S. response to that. They're hoping to, so we'll be talking about that in just a few minutes. But in the meantime, let's move on to topic number 2, which is from a Rainer Shea story. NATO's anti-Chinese lies mirror its lies about Syria.
I've studied war propaganda for years, and I know the techniques that the propagandists use to get people on their side, to hate certain leaders, governments. And in the cases of both Syria and China, it's been remarkably similar, because they've, in both these cases, they've used the NGO industrial complex, so-called human rights organizations. They've used sensationalist stories about supposed human rights abuses to legitimize their claims about these governments being tyrannical. And these propaganda narratives even share the characteristic of an attempt to manufacture consent for the construction of a separatist ethno-state within a certain part of Syria and China, respectively. In the case of Syria, it's been Rojava, a Kurdish ethno-nationalist state that's been carrying out a myriad of atrocities and cultural erasure, to the point where their atrocities are perhaps even more severe than the atrocities that Assad has supposedly committed. And in the case of China, it's been this East Turkestan idea, this idea that the Uyghurs need to create their own separate state because the need to free themselves from China is so overwhelming. And this is what these constant stories we hear about forced labor and millions of Uyghurs getting detained and so forth. This is what these stories are about. It's about manufacturing consent for balkanization, which is really the empire's only possible route towards undermining both Syria and China, due to the fact that a traditional Iraq-style regime change invasion hasn't really been viable. Also, in the cases of both of these campaigns, they've utilized religious extremist groups, really from the very same pipeline, as I've mentioned.
Yeah. It's amazing to me, once you have had several years of following these American imperial machinations, plots, conspiracies. That's what these really are. We should definitely legitimize that word conspiracy, because a lot of these things that's exactly what they are. There has been, over the last decade at least, a conspiracy to use the jihadi, right-wing, fascistic, terrorist organizations that bastardize Islam in those machinations, for imperialist goals. And one of those imperialist goals has been using ISIS and Al-Qaeda. Yes, that's Al-Qaeda, the organization that attacked the United States and murdered more than 3,000 people on 9/11, 2001. So it's a kind of severe irony, but the thing that strikes you over and over again is that these people, these CIA spooks, these planners at the Pentagon, these Wall Street billionaires who call all the shots for all of this to go on, they use the same bag of tricks over and over and over again. So you start to see the similarities there, and that's basically you've given us a fine illustration of that here. So, anything more on that?
No.
Moving on to topic number 3, which I've already spoken about. 112 billion dollar U.S. Endless Frontier Act aimed at countering Chinese tech, set for a 2-week delay, senators say. And this comes from Sputnik News, and I'm just going to report a little bit from this news item, if you'll bear with me. Yeah, anyway, this legislation basically, it's earmarked $112 billion US currency for scientific and technological research amid ongoing competition with China. But the bill will be postponed for at least 2 weeks, as I said in the headline. And this is according to American senators and their staff members in an interview on Monday. The Senate was expected to debate the bipartisan Endless Frontier Act on Wednesday. That's, after being introduced in late April, but has hit major delays, namely as over 230 amendments have been filed for consideration, according to the South China Morning Post, which reported on that on Tuesday. So they've hit a little bit of snag, and from what I understand, all of Biden's hoped for legislation is running into that same kind of snag. But the plan here, if this ever goes through, as I mentioned earlier, is to set up hubs around the country to promote the semiconductor industry, which the Americans have basically lost due to laziness, due to allowing their billionaires to ship it all abroad, and other high-tech industry hubs, for instance, 5G, which the Americans are way behind on. Everybody in the world knows China is the world leader in. New energy vehicles, self-driving vehicles, technologies having to do with the so-called Green New Deal. Anyway, the Chinese State Council proposed a similar initiative in May last year, valued at 1.4 trillion. To decouple from Western technologies, including semiconductors, 5G, artificial intelligence, as well as green energy and infrastructure. So you can see this intense competition is taking place on the economic and on the technological level, as well as on many other levels, like the one we just talked about, the level of the American government fostering terrorism and the Chinese government fighting terrorism. So this is really all part of the American hybrid war declared on the people of China in 2011 by Barack Obama and continued with hardly a change by Donald Trump when he was the emperor of the country, of the empire. And then now being picked up right where Trump left off by Biden. This is stuff, you know, people, we really need to get out and put a stop to this. It's insane, first of all, that they're poking at the Chinese dragon here, and the dragon breathes fire. The dragon breathes nuclear fire. So it's not a smart idea. Rainer?
Want to talk about smart ideas? You know, that's the thing. That's the thing that separates China and the U.S. increasingly. The U.S. keeps getting less intelligent, like as a mass, due to the proliferation of conspiracy theories, or like not legitimate conspiracy theories, made up garbage that misleads Americans, and the deterioration of U.S. education as compared to that of China, which is the total opposite. It's no wonder why China is the leader in 5G when its great technological competitor, the US, can't stop its people from absorbing conspiracy theories on Facebook that tell them that 5G is the real cause of what's making people sick, and that the coronavirus is therefore a hoax, and that the coronavirus is just a cover for the sicknesses that people are getting from 5G, and we need to go and burn down 5G cell phone towers. That's actually what they did a year ago. They live streamed it on Facebook. So it's a general discrepancy in intellectual ability between these two peoples. This is a country that's descending ever more deeply into delusional beliefs that lead to self-destruction. And the same is the case in Germany, where QAnon is thriving in a similar way, apparently.
Yeah, the long time anti-intellectual, anti-science, anti-technology thread that threads its way throughout the entirety of American history, but has usually been a minority position. It's now being promoted so openly and I mean, up until a few months ago, even by the president of the United States. And we see the outcome there. The Luddism, you know, the ism of Luddite, the ism of Lud, it has caught on pretty heavy, and it's not just in the right wing, although it's certainly there. You see more and more of it in parts of what is called the left in the United States, especially the green left and the environmentalist left. You see a lot of this environmentalist reaction, and it's really quite. I was having a debate with a woman on Facebook today who pushes a lot of these same kind of anti-science ideas. And claims that she's a Marxist, although she also says that she's a Catholic and doesn't see that there's any a contradiction there. That, you know, and that's her. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. If you're a Catholic and you want to promote Marxist ideas, that's fine. But hopefully you come to understand that there are some heavy-duty core contradictions between those two philosophical approaches to life. Anyway, next on the list, the intensification of colonial genocide will blow back, says Rainer Shea.
There's an intensification of colonial genocide going on in the United States. And it's intensifying because, well, even though genocide is obviously always been the default paradigm within the United States, in recent decades, as the US empire has reacted to its own crises, to the contradictions within its system that keep getting worse, such as economic anemia and refugee crises from its foreign interventions, and a failure of the U.S. military to retain Washington's global geopolitical hegemony. The U.S. has been reacting through making society more militarized, more inclined to discriminate against Black, Brown, and Native people, and also lately ever more racist against Asians with these kinds of anti-Chinese conspiracy theories that we've been talking about, helping proliferate anti-Asian violence. There's this reaction within the U.S. imperial structure where it thinks that if it cracks down against the colonized people and non-white people in general, then it's going to be more likely to retain its own existence. This is the logic of, this has always been the logic behind these kinds of genocides, right? Like in the case of Nazi Germany, where they believed that they had to go after certain ethnic groups in order to preserve the nation, and whatever that means to them. But there's going to be a consequence to this campaign to militarize society and carry out ever more atrocities against marginalized groups. This consequence is going to be a reaction from the masses to these very obvious contradictions within the system, to the constant murders of unarmed Black people that happen seemingly every week, to the expansion of the ICE concentration camps around the border, where brown people are getting shoved into horrifically inhumane detention centers. There's going to be reactions from the masses to these evils, and these reactions are going to result in more uprisings like the one we've seen in this last year, where arguably the largest protest movement in US history emerged in response to the George Floyd murder. And this is the reality that the US state doesn't want to face, that escalation has consequences, and that if it keeps carrying out provocations against the population, there's going to be a wave of blowbacks that could result in the rise of a serious anti-colonial proletarian revolutionary movement.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I am convinced, and I went through all of the 60s and 70s and was active in the Washington, D.C. area that saw many huge demonstrations during especially the late 60s and early 70s. I'm convinced that you are totally correct in your suspicion that the protest movement over the George Floyd murder, what I tend to call the anti-police state protests, was the largest single protest movement ever in the history of the United States. We didn't see much figures, and the figures I saw that I reported on last year on this show proved to me that was the case. But most people are totally unaware, even though, even in their own communities, there were huge demonstrations, or sometimes small demonstrations if they live in a small community. I know here in Phoenix, there were some pretty big demonstrations. The phenomenal thing was that it happened all over the country. It was totally spontaneous. You are correct. You cannot oppress and exploit and repress people the way the American empire has for a couple hundred years now, but in particular and intensely in the post-war era. You cannot do that repression without there being blowback. People will respond. People will fight back. We've seen it go off in some weird avenues, mainly because most of the great secular movements, Marxist movements in many parts of the world, like in the Middle East, like in Africa, like in Europe, have been so intensely repressed that they were movements that there was a break in continuity in those movements. So it's gone off into weird directions sometimes because of that. Like, you know, these kind of feelings come out in right-wing, you know, ways, in fascism, in religious fascism, even in the case of the Muslim world. You know, that's because there used to be some really influential socialist movements that had state power in some cases. In the Arab world, at least, that have been totally wiped out by the American imperialist warfare on them, open warfare, or, you know, hybrid warfare, one of the two. In every case, we've seen what they're trying to do to the secular socialist state and movement and political party in Syria, as an example. We see what they did to the socialist, the Arab socialist movement of Gaddafi. The CIA was very successful at undermining Gamal Nasser in Egypt, who was the president of Egypt for many years, and who led a socialist state, a socialist government in Egypt. These movements have been wiped out, basically, and the result has been that it goes off in other directions. But I think it's coming back around to where it belongs, back to Marxism, back to Marxist-Leninism, back to authentic socialism. So that's what we're going to see more and more, in my opinion. But there will be blowback, absolutely, domestically and throughout the world. So anyway, let's see where we're at right now. Next point number 5, Vietnam says it won't follow others in exposing China, or I'm sorry, in opposing China. Experts note U.S. has no chance to use sovereignty issue to divide the region. This comes from Global Times, the China Global Times. And I'm just going to share a little bit of this article with you to give you a flavor. I think it's pretty important. I spoke about this a couple of weeks ago, that I felt like Vietnam is moving closer to China. They are doing everything they can to put the past in the past where it belongs, and to seek more comradely state-to-state and party-to-party relations with China and with the Chinese Communist Party. Vietnam has made positive comments on its ties with China during the Chinese state counselor and minister of national defense Wei Fengshi's visit to the country, stressing that Vietnam will never follow other countries to oppose China. Chinese experts said on Tuesday that Hanoi is becoming increasingly mature, and it has noted the U.S. proposed Indo-Pacific strategy will undermine regional integration, unity, and peace as it uses the divergences between regional countries to hype up and escalate tensions, and Hanoi doesn't want to be made use of. We met General Secretary of the Communist Party of Vietnam, Central Committee member Nguyen Phu Trong, and Vietnamese President Nguyen Xuan Phuc on Monday during his trip to Vietnam, the Xinhua news agency reported on Monday. Extending congratulations on China's success in fighting COVID-19 and achieving economic development, Trong called on the two countries to maintain and promote their traditional friendship and advance the relationship between the two militaries of the two countries. Regarding the issue of the South China Sea, Trong said the two countries should properly handle the issue based on mutual trust and respect and prevent any related negative effect on bilateral relations. Xu Lingping, director of the Center for Southwest Asian Studies at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences in Beijing, told Global Times on Tuesday that the relationship between the Communist Party of China and the Communist Party of Vietnam has always guided and led the direction of China-Vietnam ties development. Throughout a series of tests in the past decades, the CPC-CVP relationship is becoming a ballast stone that stabilizes tensions and seeks solutions based on mutual respect when the two sides have differences. China and Vietnam are both socialist countries. They share common interests in ideology and political security, and they are more integrated in terms of economy, said Chinese analysts. Rainer?
They're not able to replicate what happened with the Sino-Soviet split. What we're witnessing now is perhaps a more unified and sustainable anti-US bloc than has ever existed in history, because not just China and Russia have been increasingly militarily aligning with each other out of necessity to counter Washington's aggressions and encirclement, but apparently Vietnam and China have been becoming increasingly close, and it's pretty desperate, this move that Washington just tried to make to cozy up to Vietnam with the hope of further dividing the global socialist movement. And I think of this, and I see the great benefits that this has for the anti-imperialist movement, and I think of the costs that would appear if a communist party that opposes China were to somehow come to state power, form their own state, and then start agitating against China. Because you don't see the people within the Communist Party of Vietnam calling the PRC a social imperialist power, or insulting Xi Jinping as a Dengite. You don't see these kinds of behaviors within the Communist Party of Vietnam, and I wonder why. Because it makes geopolitical sense, and That's just the theoretically correct line to take. The line that socialism with Chinese characteristics is not some kind of horrific, abominable farce and an insult to Marxism, but is something that can be criticized while also being recognized as legitimate.
Exactly. Yeah, I see good things in the future for the Sino-Vietnamese relationship, and see no reason to think that the American imperialists are going to have their way in attempting to divide the two countries. Even countries where they have been much more successful at dividing them from China when they shouldn't be, like Japan, for example. Japan's legislature just passed the RCEP trade block, which was initiated by China, and that we've reported on several times. And now even India is considering joining the RCEP trade block. So, and that was just last October when that trade block was announced and initiated through China's leadership. But I was really amazed to see the Japanese legislature, the Japanese parliament, getting into it, even though I knew that Japan had announced already that they had decided to join the RCEP trade bloc. So that right there, that's a big blow to the Obama, Trump, Biden anti-China pivot to hybrid war on the people of China policy. Anyway, anything more on that before we move on?
Well, I'm thinking of one of the few big critiques that I think can be legitimately applied to the Communist Party of China, which is that they had a big role to play in that Vietnamese China split that happened surrounding the Cambodia conflict. I've seen Mao and Deng be accused of an ultra-leftist foreign policy when it came to Cambodia. Like, apparently they aligned with Cambodia in spite of Pol Pot's really insane and atrocious attempt to invade Cambodia, which apparently was like the result of some kind of CIA co-optation within the Khmer Rouge.
Yeah,
where the CIA managed to not just sabotage and some kind the communistic economic project that was taking place within Cambodia at the time, and make it so that this communistic project only lasted for like 4 years between catastrophically collapsing, but also managed to greatly further disunity within the global communist movement. This was one of the great tragedies in the history of class and anti-imperialist struggle, where the CIA got its hands into this, and it forced China to make a snap decision. And one little mistake on the part of China, and some really tragic, detrimental things happened.
Yes, and of course Mao was dead by the time that happened. This is in 1979 when the Chinese-Vietnam War happened over the issue of Vietnam invading Cambodia. But I think any sane person in the entire world agrees that Vietnam's intercession in Cambodia was a humanitarian act if there ever was one. It was purely, I mean, there were, the Vietnamese had self-interest because all of the mess being caused by Pol Pot in Cambodia, in Kampuchea, as it was called then, was spilling over into Vietnam, costing the Vietnamese people and costing them a lot. But I think they did that basically for humanitarian reasons and for reasons of communist solidarity. That they saw that someone needed to move in and remove that piece of subhuman garbage called Pol Pot. The Chinese Communist Party was a different animal in 1979 than it is today. There was still a huge fight going on, an internal fight. They were still living through the death of Mao that had happened just a couple of years before, the fight between Mao's wife, Madame Mao, as she was called, and the Gang of Four, the four Communist Party leaders who were in with Madame Mao, trying to move us towards this ultra left direction, and the Deng Xiaoping wing of the party that was trying to move towards more rational new economic policy style economic system, and opening up China to the world. So you had this internal fight going on, and what ended up, China officially was still aligned with Pol Pot, with the Pol Pot regime, which was wrong. They were still aligned with Prince Sihanouk, who was still the head of state of Kampuchea, and who lived in China at the time. He was living in China under the Chinese protection. So it was a mess. It was an unfortunate mess, but and that's certainly far from the only difference between Vietnam and China. I mean, they have border disputes galore. Just the fight over the Spratly Islands and the South China Sea, for example, which Vietnam claims, China claims, the Philippines also claim, and I think maybe even Indonesia claim. So there's a lot of that kind of stuff going on, but I think that all the players have now come to the conclusion that it's best to leave this up to the special court that deals with laws of the sea issues that is taking care of it, and they just found that they can't let that get in the way of their mutual benefits through trade and through political and state-to-state relations. So, yeah, that's a time in the global communist movement that thank the gods we can put behind us. And that looks exactly to be what the Vietnamese people have done and want to do. Just as they've put behind them any hatred towards America, or at least towards Americans, and even towards Vietnam veterans. They're quite welcoming of Vietnam veterans. As a matter of fact, there's a big tourist trade in Vietnam veterans going to Vietnam, which they welcome. They're a practical and smart people, and that's part of the reason that they have one of the four fastest growing economies on the face of the planet. along with China. So other than that, let's see. Number 6 on the list, refugee crisis on top of refugee crises. Refugee crisis on top of refugee crisis, I'm sorry. America's bleak future, from Rainer Shea.
This isn't hyperbole, what you just said. It's merely an objective description of what I see happening within US borders based on the factors at play. Because the initial wave of climate migration within the US that's going to happen, well, it's already at play. It's the most obvious wave where people are migrating from the most dangerous places like storm impacted zones, fire impacted zones, the places where sea level rise will inundate houses, stuff like that. But then there's going to be this second wave, the refugee crisis on top of the refugee crisis, where there's going to be all of these social crises, such as future pandemics that will be caused by global warming and will likely be more destructive than COVID-19, crises such as breakdowns in the national power grid, which the Pentagon has said will likely happen to the majority of the power grid at some point. We don't know to what extent it'll be reparable, but that's what it seems to say will happen. Like most of the power grid is unprepared for the impacts of climatic changes. And there's going to be violent actions taken by the police and the military that will make a lot of these places a lot less habitable. Like the Pentagon, the US Army, their experts project that they'll have to intervene within the US borders in the coming decades to put down either class revolts or simply try to retain stability amid increasingly unstable areas, amid climatic natural disasters. And as the excesses of the US national security state and these internal military interventions play out, there's going to be a lot of peril created for these communities that will be experiencing quite a lot of poverty on top of the poverty that they're experiencing now. And this is going to force a lot of people to flee, perhaps even after they've fled from the most initially dangerous areas. So it's going to be disasters on top of disasters that will make a lot of people homeless and looking for places to stay. But the government isn't going to provide them with homes or shelters from the future pandemics or food. At least in a lot of cases, people will be left behind because the trend of neoliberalism is increasing austerity, increasing privatization, ever lower wages, ever more deregulation, ever more corporate tyranny that proliferates poverty and destitution.
Yeah, wow. This is a very possible future that we can look forward to if this goes on, if we continue to allow the capitalists to run our world, or at least to run large parts of it. And the solution is pretty obvious. The solution is socialist revolution. Okay, next on the list, Andrew Brown shot dead by kill shot to the head while fleeing police. Attorneys say, as release of body cam clip illuminates this, and this comes from RT. I also consulted an article from or a video from CNN on this issue. I imagine a lot of people have already heard of this. It happened last week. Andrew Brown, 42-year-old North Carolina man from Elizabeth City, North Carolina, was in his car when police went to his home intending to serve a search warrant. He saw the police coming, got scared. According to his son, he was scared for his life. And according to the legal team for the Brown family that was able to view a very short, like a 22-second clips of one of the body cams. I guess there were 5 body cam tapes from 4 other body cams. So 5 body cams in all that have footage that the family is demanding through a lawsuit to be able to see. Today, the court in the county that Elizabeth City is in ruled that the body cam footage will not be released to the public, which has got a lot of people angry. There are big demonstrations in Elizabeth City. The mayor of Elizabeth City has instituted a curfew. Well, according to RT, Elizabeth City has essentially locked down in preparation for the unrest that they anticipate, very similar to the unrest that broke out after the murder of George Floyd, the unrest in Brookline Center, Minnesota, last year. So more of the same. The son, Brown's son, called the police killing an execution. I agree with him. So there's a fight on the way there. I anticipate this will spread to other cities. I think it already has. And definitely, at least in North Carolina, and this part of North Carolina is having a big effect. We can really see this as part of the ongoing battle against the police state. So there you have it. Rainer?
This is an example of what I've been observing, where the state is already and is going to continue to be very reluctant to let the public access evidence of its atrocities if the state can help it. Like in instances like these, the government is clearly protecting itself from further incrimination out of fear that the police state and the state in general are going to further lose public legitimacy. But as we're seeing now, when the masses look at something like this, they clearly they don't react by saying, "Oh, I guess we shouldn't jump to conclusions then." I guess if we're not going to see the evidence, we should be measured in our response. They're like screw that. Obviously, the state is hiding something horrifying. They're lying by omission, and they need to be brought to justice.
Right.
And that's a consequence of the state's censorship policies, like trying to cover up its future atrocities. That's something to consider. That when the public sees that the state is hiding something, the public isn't going to be like, "Oh, I guess things are cool." They're going to rise up.
Exactly. Okay, next on the list and final, How climate collapse will overwhelm the U.S. military, Rainer Shea.
Climate collapse, from what we can tell, is going to severely limit the reach of the U.S. armed forces in the coming decades. According to a 2019 Pentagon report that I cite in my article, by 2040 alone, a lot of the reach that the U.S. armed forces have in places like Africa and the Middle East right now is going to be reduced simply because of the fact that U.S. troops will lose access to a lot of the water that they used to have access to in slightly colder times. And from what this report says, the only way that the U.S. military would be able to overcome these obstacles is if it were to invest in vast amounts of local water capturing technologies that the U.S. military simply does not have the resources to equip itself with, despite the maximum level that U.S. funds are increasingly reaching. Even though the U.S. empire is the largest empire in the history of the world, even though they're depriving their people, even though the U.S. is depriving its people of humanitarian resources to build up its unparalleled military might, it still can't manage to gather together the resources to sustain its global military presence in the face of climate collapse. That's how big the catastrophe we're facing is. It's so substantial that the U.S. military isn't strong enough to overcome it. And this applies also to all the U.S. military bases around the world and along the U.S. coast that are going to be inundated with rising water levels as the sea levels rise. And these are the things that the U.S. military will need to think about if it's going to have a fighting chance in the coming class war. But due to the enormity of the crisis that the military is facing, apparently the consensus within the military on a lot of these issues is, let's just not talk about it, or let's merely acknowledge, let's merely try to address the climate crisis issue by, say, investing in greener technologies, or in trying to retain our troop presence best we can despite the growing uninhabitable zones. These measures aren't going to cut it. The military can't overcome the enormity of the crisis that it's facing. And this is going to cause dysfunction for the military's domestic interventions when these interventions inevitably happen. And this will create openings for future revolution. Looks like.
Yeah, that's apparently the military has been well aware of these problems for quite some time, and has umpteen planning mechanisms and planning papers and so forth to deal with it. And it amazes me that they even think that they can try, because this kind of a situation is made for it's tailor-made for chaos and for losing control, and for people. The one thing they're not considering, I don't think at all, is the fact that there will be mass desertion from the military when this is occurring. People will, look back. They'll see their own families and friends and neighbors in chaos, and they'll think, "Fuck this shit! I'm leaving this and going to help my family, to help my friends, to help my community." Fuck this military shit. I didn't sign up for this. You know, that's what always happens in this kind of a situation that we can anticipate. The amazing thing is that they don't do the obvious thing, which is start knocking some fucking heads in together in Washington, D.C. and on Wall Street in New York, and shaking some sense into these idiots who are causing this chaos to come down upon us, the capitalist class that is causing this chaos to come down upon us. One would think that some, at least in the military hierarchy, would start to realize, hey, we've got to start bringing some fucking common sense to these people who, to these civilian authorities and these economic paymasters who are running this show, that what they're doing now is ass backward and wrong. We got to do something to change this shit, but they're not. You know, I think probably fear rules, and they all realize that any military brass who would actually bring up a thought like that, and I'm sure there are those who haven't, that would be the end of their career, and they'd be booted out in no time at all. So, yeah, once again, there is a solution, people. It's called socialist revolution. The solution is socialist revolution. So, anything more on that?
Well, there's also the factor of the far-right radicals who will be present both within the U.S. armed forces and around them. And will you describe that scenario where a lot of these people defect out of practical necessity? I imagine there's going to also be a contingent among them who takes their fight in the class war into some kind of vigilante mission where they decide to go on rampages like Kyle Rittenhouse,
yeah,
and shoot at protesters or Communist Party headquarters or whatever else they decide to take up arms against. There's going to be a lot of terrorism in this scenario, the scenario where a failed state like Ukraine or Libya style occurs within the United States, and where these far-right vigilantes and far-right paramilitary organizations will be unleashed. It seems like vigilantism and paramilitaries are the backup military option for the capitalist ruling class. Like, that's their backup fighting force in the face of such a crisis where their military starts to disintegrate. They'll probably use their intelligence operatives to integrate these vigilantes and paramilitaries into the state and try to coordinate a campaign of Ukraine-style terror against the forces of class struggle. At that point, we're going to really be embroiled in a conflict that's probably not going to end until we actually become as stable as China has become and get the resources to both militarily contain the far-right terrorists with socialist state police forces and re-educate them, like how China has re-educated the people who are at risk of committing terrorist attacks within Xinjiang.
Yeah. Well, you know, luckily among the working class, that is a definite minority. Those people, the far right types that are attracted to fascism, that are attracted to vigilante death squads, that kind of thing, and the side of the working class, even especially including in the U.S. military, in the ranks, is far, far larger. So At least as things stand now, I think that it won't be that big a problem to contain those kinds of forces. It certainly wasn't on January 6th. The last time we saw some of those forces emerge, there was actually a big fear that some people in the military, and of course a lot of people in the police, came out of that. Police is where that kind of people, I mean, I've seen statistics that say that something like 50% of all police in America are openly, sympathetic to fascist ideas, to fascism, into racism, into white supremacist ideas. But the military is quite a bit different. The military is working class primarily, and among those working class people, the progressive side, the pro-socialist side, I believe, is far greater in the military. So, if we see splits in the military among the ranks, and they go off with a lot of their heavy armor, with a lot of their heavy weaponry and armor, and take it with them, a lot more of those people will be on our side, I believe, than on the right wing nut side. We'll see how it goes, though. As I say, this is one possible future. It's not the only future. It's certainly not the future that we should want. We should want to do everything in our power to fight to ensure that that future never happens. So anyway, that's it for the show tonight. Rainer, as always, yeoman's job, stupendous work on your part. Some really fascinating writing that you've done. Hopefully everybody will come back to learn more. We'll include links to all of your articles, to the RainerShea.com articles, and we'll include links to all of the other articles mentioned under this video when we post it. So Rainer, thanks so much. Thank you to all of our viewers and listeners, and until next week, so long.